From FingerLakes1.com, I'm Josh Durso, and this is Inside the FLX. Today, our program is going to be a little different. Typically, we bring in news makers and talk to them about things they're working on. However, over the last several months, we've been making it a point to talk with the people who bring the news to you in various formats. Our guest today is a local broadcast legend, whether you hear him every morning on the way to work like I do, or you've listened to one of the high school or collegiate games he's called in his lengthy career. Ted Baker is one of the most recognizable names and voices in local media. He still calls dozens of games every year, but he is the daily host of Finger Lakes Morning News, heard on WGVA and WAUB from 5:30 a.m. to 9 a.m. Ted, thanks a lot for coming in today.
Great to be here. Appreciate the opportunity.
You might be the hardest working man in local media.
Everyone says that, but it doesn't ever seem like it. I mean, I'm sure it's like what you do. If you love it, it doesn't seem like work.
Right. So for those who maybe they've been living under a rock for the last 30 or 35 years, for those who don't know you, a little bit about yourself, how you got into broadcasting, and now obviously your long career in broadcasting.
Well, I grew up in northern New Hampshire, and I consciously made the decision to get into broadcasting probably about my junior year of high school. But I'm told that as a kid, when we were out in the car, I was like reading the road signs and stuff as we went by. So I think it was kind of always destined.
Play-by-play on day trips.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in a kind of a classic era for New England sports. In New Hampshire, everybody followed the Boston teams. So I grew up listening to the announcers for the Red Sox and the Bruins and the Patriots and the Celtics. And it just occurred to me one day that that's what I wanted to do, primarily sportscasting. I also knew that that wasn't something that you generally broke into as a specialty, so I went to a one-year broadcasting school in Boston out of high school, came back, and in August, the summer after I got out, there was an opening at one of the two little small-town stations in the paper mill town of Berlin, New Hampshire. The job was being a disc jockey, and the manager said, by the way, the guy that you're replacing was our play-by-play sports guy. Do you know how to do play-by-play sports? And I said, you betcha I do. I didn't, but I told him I did, so I kind of lucked into that. My very first job in broadcasting, I got to do sports. In the early 1980s, I had a cousin who was living in the Dallas-Fort Worth area of Texas, and he was working at a station, told me about an opening there. So at age 23, I went out to Texas and did Texas high school football, Friday Night Lights, the whole thing, went to Cowboys games for a few years. Came back to New Hampshire. I was working at a station in western Massachusetts that got taken over by some new ownership in 2001. The new ownership decided that they wanted their own people, which wasn't me, so I found myself out of work in late 2001. I saw in a broadcast trade publication an advertisement for an opening in Geneva, New York, so I applied for the job. And my boss now, Alan Bishop, called me up to bring me in for an interview, and he said, looking at my resume, he says, "You're from Berlin, New Hampshire?" I said, "Yeah." Is this a trick? He's from Berlin, New Hampshire, born in the same hospital that I was about 4 months before me. We would have been high school classmates had his family not moved away when he was young, and so we had an instant kind of bond there. And he brought me on in January of 2003. I was the program director, not the morning host at that time. Mike Racinko, who was doing the Finger Lakes Morning News, went on to do other things. So in 2006 is when I started waking up at 4 a.m. every day.
Waking up at, just soak that in for a minute, people. Waking up at 4 a.m. every day, Monday through Friday, to talk about the news for a 3.5-hour block, essentially. Walk us through what that daily grind looks like, because I think that's something that a lot of folks might not have the perspective on.
Well, I live in Rushville. It's about 15 miles away from the studios in Geneva, so I'm up at 4, out the door right around 4:30. I get to work a few minutes before 5. The first thing I do is start putting together the sports scores for when we read the sports twice an hour, so I gather those all up, pro, high school, focusing on the local scene, and that's one of the things that's changed. I mean, in the old days, radio stations would do all the national scores and everything. Now you're getting that on your phone. You've got the ESPN app. So we focus on the local high school stuff. So I put that together. The program begins at 5:30. Most of the first half hour is pre-recorded ag programming, so I kind of have a chance to catch my breath, check Twitter, check Finger Lakes One, check around, see what's going on, what are we going to talk about today, any breaking kind of headline stuff overnight. And then we start at 5:30. We have local news twice an hour. 3 times a morning we have our talk segments. And for those who don't know how Finger Lakes News Radio is structured, we have Greg Cotterill, who does the news on WGVA. He's across the window from me. And then we have Steve Penstone, who is in our Auburn studio, and he does the news for WAUB. So when we do local news, we split the network and the Finger Lakes basically in half. So the eastern half gets their news, western half gets their news. And then at the end of the newscast, we do our famed chit-chat segment, which can be anything from my opinions on Donald Trump to hockey to almost anything.
So obviously you're referencing something that has become really important, local news, actual local news. How concerned are you when you see sort of this vacuum that's being created? Obviously, using the Finger Lakes as an example, Finger Lakes One, Finger Lakes Radio Group, there aren't too many, some shrinking newspapers. There aren't a lot of players in that pond anymore, and there was a time when every single community had its own local news outlet. Your thoughts on how that sort of evolved and what's left now?
Well, I'm very concerned. Going back to the very beginning, when I started out in that little town of Berlin, New Hampshire, there were 2 local radio stations. This was before computers, before satellites. The only way you could have radio programming on, pretty much, with a few exceptions, was to have it live. So every local radio station had a morning disc jockey, a midday disc jockey, afternoon, night, maybe overnight if there were 24 hours, a few part-time weekend people. So in that little town in 1978, there were roughly 10 to 12 full-time radio announcing jobs and another 6, 8 or so part-time jobs. In 2018, there are none. Only one of the 2 stations exists anymore, and it simulcasts programming from other distant stations. So employment opportunities in this business are way down. We're at a very challenging time because anybody who relies on advertising knows that there are a lot of different ways to advertise. When I started in 1978, there was the local radio and there was the local newspaper. There's now internet, there's digital. As we all know, if you Google a product, that product's going to follow you around for the next 3 days, every place you go online. There's a lot of ways to get that message out. So what we've done, because we want to and because we've had to, I mean, it's the same thing that you do at Finger Lakes One. You focus on the things that ESPN.com or NewYorkTimes.com isn't going to bring you, and that's the local stuff. So we're heavy into the local news, into local sports. We try to talk about what's going on locally. It's a difficult time, and we've seen what's happened with newspapers. That's beginning to affect us, I think, in both radio and television, and we're going to have to change and work hard and survive some tough times, I think, to have a bright future.
Is there an opportunity, though, for something like radio, which is more interactive than a traditional newspaper? Is there an opportunity for radio to sort of reclaim some of the power that it once had as newspapers continue to sort of shrink down a little bit?
Well, the opportunity's there. One of the challenges that we face, I mean, my format, news talk radio, tends to draw an older audience. So the people listening to us grew up with radio. They remember Jerry Sherwin playing music on WGVA back in the 60s. The younger generation, a lot of them, they don't listen to radio very much. It used to be where you went to get brand new music. Well, now, I got 1,000 songs strapped to my hip on my phone, as we most of us do. So that's one of the big challenges is getting younger people to find a use for radio.
Now, what about I'm going to turn this around because you mentioned employment opportunities. I think that's a really interesting part of the discussion because that seems to be the one thing that I see in young people now is that there isn't much of an interest, and I'm not sure if it's just the climate of media or if it's because of the lack of opportunities, especially in smaller markets. Doesn't seem to be a whole lot of young people interested in taking up this line of work as something that they want to do for the rest of their lives.
Well, one of the reasons for that is you don't need a radio station anymore.
Right.
You can start your own blog, your own podcast. I mean, look at the people on YouTube that have 1 million followers. I mean, there's 14-year-old kids with Instagram channels that reach more people than I do.
Right.
So on one hand, the traditional media may not be there, but you can be a media personality. You can, I mean, with a very small investment in equipment, you can be worldwide in a day.
Mm-hmm. Now, let's talk a little bit about the focus on, I'll call it the Donald Trump effect. You obviously spend quite a bit of time on your morning program from time to time going through the sort of daily grind that is Donald Trump. Some of the things that have surprised you most about his tenure thus far, and where you think this sort of leaves the presidency in the historical context.
Well, all right. Warning, liberal opinions. And I'm not really, I don't think I'm as liberal as a lot of people do.
Right.
I tend to lean leftward. So I guess it just starts with the ability to get away with saying things that aren't true day after day after day. And I think I'm pretty on solid footing to say that. I mean, it's been documented, but it's almost like if you blast out enough stuff that isn't true, the traditional media is not geared to handle that. Right. I mean, fact checkers get overwhelmed. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's part of it. And then the other part is what Donald Trump has done, he's expanded on something that George W. Bush did, which is realize, because again, with all the changes in the ways of delivering messages, that it's now possible to go around the fake news media and get your message directly out to people through other channels. So that media role of gatekeeper has kind of gone away, because I can go right on Facebook or I can go right to some internet group or something and communicate my message, not going through that filter of the mainstream media.
Do you subscribe to the idea that there is all of the large media companies that exist out there, the national ones that we hear about all the time, the CNNs, the Turners, the MSNBCs, the Foxes, they're all evil to some extent in that they are all corporately owned, totally beholden to advertisers, that sort of thing, because that seems to be where the discussion always goes. And I personally always look at it and say, well, the answer is local news, local programming. That's the answer to it. Is that how you view that whole issue, or do you think there are good players in the sea of rotten?
We've always been beholden to advertisers. I mean, to the credit of our company, my boss, Alan Bishop, has rarely, if ever, told me what I could or couldn't say. I've said things that have antagonized advertisers and lost us money. But to his credit, I mean, obviously I don't do that on purpose, and I certainly try to limit it, or I'm not going to be working there much longer. But so the media's always been beholden to advertisers. I think what's happened, and it goes back to what we were talking about before, the increased competition for ad dollars. The criticism is always the media's liberal. It's the liberal media. I think more what it is, it's geared now more towards sensationalism and, turn on the television stations in the morning. Everything's always deadly this and controversy that. I mean, one of the things we struggle with in news radio is, do we give the audience what they seem to say they want, which is blood and gore and controversy, or do we give them what we think they ought to have to become better informed citizens? We all have to walk that line. If nobody's watching this podcast and nobody's listening to me in the morning, then it doesn't matter what we say.
And how in your opinion, obviously, because you just brought up a really broad point, but a good one, I think. How do you walk that line, or what is that appropriate line that companies large and small have to start to sort of think about and, sort of hold the line somewhere so that it doesn't blur or skew one way or another?
Well, I think it comes down to the most fundamental thing in any kind of news is tell the truth. If you're telling the truth and you've done your reporting and you've got your facts straight, people can be mad at what you say, but it's pretty hard to criticize the truth.
Right.
If we're telling it the way it is, then You might not like it, but you really don't have a whole lot of room to complain about it.
Does the speed at which reporting happen now erode that effort of chasing down the truth? Or do you think that most organizations do a fairly good job of fact-checking before they run with what could be a tough headline?
It absolutely erodes it. Classic case, there's a Supreme Court website and blog called SCOTUS blog, and when they had, I don't remember the year, but it was one of the challenges to Obamacare, and it was the Supreme Court, it was a split ruling where they ruled that Obamacare was unconstitutional under one part of the Constitution, but okay under another. Mm-hmm. And what happened with most of the major networks, they got the summary from the court, they read the very first part, unconstitutional under this clause, and they all ran out and reported that it was struck down. Mm-hmm. But on page 2, it said no, it wasn't struck down because they ruled that under the taxing clause, it was still okay. So there was an example where most of the major networks were reporting this story incorrectly, and it took them a long time to turn the ship around and get it right. So that's one of the things that we have to be very careful about. Twitter, great tool. Anything that happens, it's on Twitter, but does that mean that it's right? So it's incumbent upon us in the media, make sure that's right first before you go out and report it. Everybody's gone through a case of you report, I did this a few years ago, heard that somebody had passed away, went on the air, said, so sorry, this guy passed away. Well, he didn't pass away.
He was still there.
Yeah.
So staying with the whole media theme, we talked on your show a few weeks ago about the Sinclair controversy. Obviously relevant to what we're talking about now. Your thoughts, your feelings on that, because I thought you had some really interesting perspective when we were talking about it a few weeks ago. Expand on it a little bit, how that made you feel watching that sort of play out and see it get national attention and have ramifications on local media, actual local media.
For people who aren't familiar with Sinclair Media, they are a national owner of television stations. Their ownership is very conservative, and they compel their news departments to do certain stories, which are, in my opinion, opinion pieces disguised as news. I understand, again, there's audiences out there. If you want to reach a conservative audience, you've got to give them things that they want to hear. But I think it crosses a line when you label opinion as news, or for that matter, when you don't make it clear to your audience that this is something being handed to us from above. I think that's a bad precedent.
What do you make of the discussion that this does, or that kind of policy does actually impact the way those local reporters and anchors are reporting on things that are happening inside the community? Does it have an impact, or do you think that's sort of overstated a little bit in that how could that possibly, we reread those pieces every day. It doesn't affect how you or I do our jobs, right?
Well, here's the impact. If I'm a local reporter, and I don't remember which of the Rochester stations it is that Sinclair owned.
13 WAM.
Okay, it's Channel 13.
Yep.
So if I'm a reporter at that station, I don't have to have the boss explicitly censor me. I know who owns my company. You're going to naturally say to yourself, let's suppose you've got a big story about a huge scandal affecting a local Republican politician. Mm-hmm. Am I going to risk drawing the anger of my management by running this, or am I going to self-edit? That's the problem. It's not explicit censorship. It's the implicit kind where you know. If you know that you're owned by a conservative company and they want conservative points of view on the air, why do I, as a local reporter, want to stick my neck out and risk trouble over this story? So I maybe ignore it and don't do it.
Do you think that connects back to the turnover that local media, or I should say local broadcast, especially on the television scene, seems to have? Because Twitter is a great example. It's something that a few of my friends were talking about recently. You can go on to any reporter's Twitter profile and see the list of different news stations that they've worked for or worked with. Does that hurt the local aspect of it too, because you have these people sort of coming and going, where you don't have those people like you who literally learned from the ground up what the Finger Lakes is?
There's less of that kind of motion in radio now because there are fewer opportunities. Really, I mean, what it comes down to in television is most of these moves are for more money in bigger markets. I mean, you start out, maybe you start out in the southern tier in Elmira, Corning, and then you get a job in Rochester, which is a little bigger market, and then maybe you move up to Cincinnati, and then you ultimately New York City or Los Angeles. So I mean, that's why people move in television. It's better pay. Obviously, the more people watching or listening, the more you can charge for advertising and the more you get paid. I mean, Rush Limbaugh has 600 or 800 stations and tens of millions of listeners and makes a heck of a lot of more money than we do.
Why? Okay, so I am interested in getting your perspective on this one. It just came to me. I was listening to a radio show on your network, I want to say about 2 weeks ago, and they were having this little panel discussion about why those large syndicated conservative voices and hosts get the traction they do compared to the liberal ones that seem to there seems to be an equal number of them out there, but one seems to get a lot more traction, especially on radio, than the other does. What do you attribute that to, or what do you sort of see in that whole debate?
A couple of things. One is that conservatives got there first. Rush Limbaugh, what happened was along and about the, I guess, early 90s, we had satellite technology come along, which made it possible to easily and cheaply feed a program out to multiple stations. Before that, almost all the talk radio was on larger city stations because you had to have local talent, and they were the ones that could afford it. So Rush came along, and a few others like them. So they got the conservative side got the first foothold. And then the second part, frankly, is I think it goes down to station management. I think most management in broadcasting tends to lean conservative, and so they aren't going to want liberal voices on their radio stations. It's been tried. I mean, there was Air America a few years ago, which was a liberal network that failed, and it's very hard because most of the talk stations are conservative. So if you have a conservative program station, you're probably not going to put a liberal on there. If most of your audience is used to tuning in for Rush and Hannity, they're not going to want to hear a left-leaning voice in the middle of that.
Right. Where do you sort of rank what's happening with, I almost want to say, it seems like a little bit of a resurgence for public radio. This sort of step back to the WXXIs, what you guys have in Geneva, WAOS. Is that another aspect of it where those sort of opposing views can start to be heard again and heard more regularly?
A little bit of it. I think there's a certain fatigue that sets in. Even if you're a dyed-in-the-wool conservative, how many hours a day do you want to listen to of the same thing, how bad Hillary is and how great Donald Trump is? Or if you're on the other side, if it was an all left-leaning world, which is part of the reason why in our programming on Finger Lakes News Radio, in the middle of the day, we have Clark Howard and Dave Ramsey, who are financial shows, not so partisan, because my belief was, even if you're as conservative as can be, I don't think you want to hear that for 8 hours every day. So I think that's one of the things is that public radio, well, for one thing, it's a lot less superficial in its treatment of things because it doesn't have that same advertising pressure. So they can afford to do an in-depth 15-minute piece on something where the local TV news in the morning is going to do a quick 1-minute piece and then go on to the royal wedding.
So I want to get in a couple quick hits here. Your biggest pet peeve in broadcast journalism, news, whatever it may be. What is your biggest pet peeve over your 40-year career? I'm sure some things have irritated you over the years. What is that one thing that you keep seeing that just makes you shake your head every time you see it or hear it?
Oh, I don't know if there's any one thing. I mean, I guess anyone who makes their living with words, I think we need to be careful about what we say and that the words make sense. I mean, I'm always criticizing the TV station saying we're live at so and so. Well, you're live even when you're in the studio. What you mean is you're on location. I mean, I guess that's kind of picky stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, really a pet peeve. Mm-hmm. My biggest thought that's in my head right now is just for the future of our business, because it's become so automated and there are so few people compared to, I mean, we run our 6 stations at the Finger Lakes Radio Group with about the number of people that it would have taken to run one in the 1970s or 80s. So there are fewer opportunities for new people coming up. I guess it's, I'll put my cards on the table. I don't know if there'll be radio in 20 years. There'll still be a way of sending audio or video content out. Maybe it'll migrate all online. Maybe what we're doing here will replace what radio is. I don't know. It's a shame, because I remember when your local radio, so like you said, Seneca Falls had WSFW, Waterloo had WNYR. Yeah. Every little town had a station. The local disc jockeys were all known. Mm-hmm. It was a place to be and a kind of a shared community before we had social media. I guess maybe radio was the first social media. Mm-hmm. Everyone would gather around the radio at night, and here comes the new song.
That interaction.
Right. Here's the brand new Beatles song, and I'm going to dedicate this to the Minders Blue Devils for just winning the championship. And I think we're losing some of that as the media world fragments.
Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, you have longevity in a space that, frankly, it lends itself to. It's not physically laborious. As long as the market exists, we can exist. This is something I think about all the time when people ask me why I chose to do this as opposed to something else. I can do this, as far as I see, pretty much right up until I die. And that is so what do you attribute your own personal longevity in this field to? Is it a personal quality that you've carried on, or just a mindset, or what?
Well, it's mostly, more than anything else, it's that I identified what I wanted to do with my life very early on and have had the opportunity to do it ever since. I can't imagine doing anything else. I very briefly, in between a couple of radio stations jobs, did some other things and wasn't very good at them. People seem to think I'm decent at what I do, and I enjoy it. It's right. I'm all, probably it's the same thing with you. I'm all full of these opinions and ideas, and I'm grateful to have the outlet every day to get them out.
Mm-hmm. Now, our 30 minutes is just about up, but I want to give you the opportunity. Where can people listen to you? Where can they find you? Obviously, you guys have a lot of properties. Your voice is almost everywhere in the Finger Lakes.
Well, the Finger Lakes Morning News and Finger Lakes News Radio are 96.1 FM and 1240 AM in Geneva, WGVA. If you're in Auburn, 98.1 FM, 1590 AM, WAUB. Our website is fingerlakesdailynews.com, and we have a listen link where you can listen live to any of the stations, and we archive our sports and things. And then my second job, which I'm leaving for as soon as we're done here, is freelancing for Hobart and William Smith on WEOS and WHWS. That's where you hear Hobart and William Smith sports. I'm off to New Jersey for the William Smith Herons first-round lacrosse game tomorrow.
Excellent. Well, I hope you have a good weekend. Enjoy that time, and find some time to rest in there, because you'll be back on the air less than 24 hours after that last game, potentially, right?
Yeah, it's like I said, it isn't work to me. I enjoy it. I enjoy the road trips. I get to have a nice dinner that somebody else pays for. And I always say my job is I get to watch sports from the best seat in the house, and all I have to do is tell you what I see.
Yep. All right. Well, I really appreciate your time. Thanks a lot, and best of luck continuing forward.
Thank you, and I hope I can pick up some swing tips here from you in the next couple of weeks.
We can work on that. All right, well, that's going to do it for us today. I'd like to thank Ted, our listeners, and, of course, FingerLakes1.com for making this podcast possible. You can catch Inside the FLX on Saturdays during the 10 o'clock hour on WDWN 89.1 FM in Auburn or 97.7 FM in Fulton. The program also airs on Sundays and Tuesdays at 7 p.m. on Spectrum, channel 1304, and is available on iTunes, Stitcher, and the FingerLakes1.com app. Stay informed, Finger Lakes, and we will catch you next time.